Welcome to Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Let's get right to the week's top stories.
I'm Ali Velshi, sitting in on a special edition of Alex Wagner tonight. In the last hour, we heard from the President of the United States in his first extended on-air interview since last week's debate. 22 uninterrupted minutes. President Joe Biden standing firm despite concerns in and among those in his party that he's staying in this race, that he is the man who can defeat Donald Trump in November. In an exclusive interview with ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos, President Biden was asked about his fitness to serve.
Elections are about the future, not the past. They're about tomorrow, not yesterday. And the question on so many people's minds right now is, can you serve effectively for the next 4 years?
George, I'm the guy that put NATO together, the future. No one thought I could expand it. I'm the guy that shut Putin down. No one thought could happen. I'm the guy that put together the South Pacific Initiative with AUKUS. I'm the guy that got 50 nations, not only in Europe, outside of Europe as well, to help Ukraine. I'm the guy that got Japanese to expand their budget. For example, when I decided we used to have 40% of the computer chip in it. We invented the chip, that little chip for the computer chip. It's in everything from cell phone to weapons. And so we used to have 40%, and we're down to virtually nothing. So I get in the plane against the advice of everybody, and I fly to South Korea. I convinced them to invest in the United States, billions of dollars. Now we have tens of billions of dollars being invested in the United States, making us back in a position where we're going to own that industry again.
Addressing his poor performance at the debate, Biden said he had a cold and that it was just a bad night.
I guess the question, the problem is here for a lot of Americans watching is you've said, going back to 2020, watch me, to people who are concerned about your age. And, 50 million Americans watched that debate. It seemed to confirm fears they already had.
Well, look, after that debate, I did 10 major events in a row, including until 2 o'clock in the morning after that debate. I did events in North Carolina. I did events in Georgia. I did events like this today. Large crowds, overwhelming response, no slipping. And so I just had a bad night. I don't know why.
Biden reiterated that nothing will convince him to step down from the race unless, in his words, the Lord Almighty comes down. And at one point, George Stephanopoulos asked him to reflect.
Are you sure you're being honest with yourself when you say you have the mental and physical capacity to serve another 4 years?
Yes, I am, because, George, the last thing I want to do is not be able to meet that. I think, as some of the senior economists and senior foreign policy specialists say, if I stop now, I'd go down in history as a pretty successful president. No one thought I could get done what we got done.
But are you being honest with yourself as well about your ability to defeat Donald Trump right now?
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
All right, we'll hear more from President Biden as he continues to campaign, and next week when he's expected to hold a solo news conference during the NATO summit in Washington. Joining us now, NBC News senior political reporter Sahil Kapoor, plus NBC White House correspondent Mike Memoli, who was with the president in Wisconsin ahead of the ABC interview, and White House reporter for the Washington Post, Yasmin Abutaleb, is here. Basil Smykel also remains with me. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Mike, I want to start with you, because you have literally known Joe Biden the longest. You have traveled with him for a long time. There's no question, regardless of how he answers George Stephanopoulos, we're all older than we were 7 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. What's your sense of how he responded, and what's sort of the Biden world sense of how he performed tonight?
Well, Ali, the view of the campaign tonight is that when you take tonight's interview, in which they believe he took every tough question that George Stephanopoulos could muster, and you combine that with the rally that I was covering here in Wisconsin this afternoon, you see a president who continues to energize and motivate the core group of supporters who are in that room, but also still has the values that got him into this office in the first place and is focused on the right things, the voters, and can still beat Donald Trump. Now, as I've been looking at my phone every minute since this interview was over, it's not clear to me that the audience he needed to reach and convince tonight was satisfied. A lot of Democrats who I've been talking to throughout the past week feel like it's been maybe 2 steps forward, but 3 steps back, that maybe this interview would have been more effective had he did it in combination with that rally last week in North Carolina, the day after the debate, rather than something that built over time, took on a sort of a Super Bowl type level of importance by the buildup to this tonight. And so watching President Biden there, I just see the person I've been covering now for over 16 years now, somebody who is very proud of his record. He thinks he has done more in 4 years as president than any president before him. He thinks he still can and will beat Donald Trump. The audience that needs to be convinced, though, is in his party. And I think everyone watching tonight is going to take away, maybe they thought he held his own, but the debate performance last Thursday, we can't overstate what a seismic moment that was in shaking the confidence of Democrats. And it's going to take a lot more than one rally and one interview to reassure Democrats. And the stakes for every appearance going forward are so high that I think Democrats are going to continue to be walking on eggshells until this is resolved, potentially.
Yasmin, you had an interesting article in which you interviewed a whole lot of people about Joe Biden and sort of the changes to him. And you make an interesting point, and this is why I was asking Mike Memley about this. Those who do not interact with Biden regularly, such as Democratic donors and foreign leaders, are often the ones who notice the change most acutely. Senior aides who interact with Biden regularly said they have not noticed stark changes. And that's pretty logical, right? I mean, I think we can probably all think about that in our own lives. If you don't see somebody for a year or two, you'll notice they've gained weight, lost weight, look older, seem younger. The people around Biden who are encouraging him to stick with this are family, friends, and people who work with him every day.
I think that's exactly right. My colleagues today had a story about how Senator Mark Warner, who is the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee or chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee, is working to convene a group of senators to try to convince President Biden to exit the race. And I think this is really important because Senator Warner is viewed as a very serious senator. He has a good relationship with the president. He has been critical at times of the administration, but people have said his family, his close aides are not likely to tell him to exit the race. And if anyone is going to ultimately prevail upon him, it doesn't mean they will, it would be senators, given that he served in the Senate for 36 years. And I think in this article we did about the president's aging seeming to accelerate in the last few months, according to people who have interacted with him, they mostly pointed to physical traits, the stiffer gait, which the president himself has acknowledged in recent days, that he just moves around slower. But they also mentioned, more frequent lapses, like briefly losing his train of thought before getting back on track, or just seeming a little bit less lucid. One of, I think, the most striking anecdotes that we got in that story was that leaders at the G7, who typically only see the president once a year, every few months, if they come to Washington for a bilateral meeting, were especially struck by how much older he seemed when they saw him, and came away with the impression of wondering that he seemed able to do the job now, but they couldn't fathom how he would be able to do it 4 years from now. And I think that's probably the question a lot of voters are grappling with when they see him. He gives speeches. He was energetic at the rally in Wisconsin today, but I think the physical appearance in many ways bears on voters' impressions of whether he can continue to do this job for another term.
Sahil, one of the interesting things from your reporting is that while Joe Biden was pretty clear, Stephanopoulos must have asked him a version of this a dozen times about will you consider stepping out? Would you step out? And of course, he said, not unless the Lord Almighty comes down himself. Your reporting is otherwise, that he is torn between this idea of staying in and what happens if the wave of people calling for him to step aside gets substantially larger.
Yeah, that's right, Ali. A big part of the goal here for President Biden was to try to assure the jittery, anxious Democrats that he's still up for this, that the debate performance last week was an aberration, not the norm. There are a lot of Democrats who were skeptical, and over the last 30 or 40 minutes, talking to a bunch of Democratic lawmakers and officials who watched that debate, I don't think he has convinced them. Now, this was not the disastrous performance that they witnessed last Thursday. It's very clear, however, that he wasn't quite as incoherent last time. He was able to put his thoughts together. He did this thing, that Biden often does, where he trails off into a tangent, and then he catches himself and says anyway, and then tries to pivot back. I think people who have followed Biden for a while are familiar with that. But there are several things that stuck out to the Democratic sources that I've talked to. The first is one Democratic lawmaker texted me saying Biden still looks shaky even under controlled conditions. That last response is the one that has gotten Democrats most nervous, where he was asked, what happens if you lose to Donald Trump? And Biden said something along the lines of, I believe I'm the best person to do this. And if I give it my all, do my best, then that's what it's really about. One Democratic official texted that they were sick to their stomach hearing that, said this is not youth sports, that Biden himself has said this is about the survival of democracy. The fate of the republic is on the line. And here he is saying, all I can do here is do my best. And there is an element of denial here that is also sticking with some Democrats about the polls, about the state of the race. We know that Joe Biden consistently feels underestimated, and he's got some legitimate beef in that regard. But when it comes to general election polls, the 2020 polls showed him crushing Donald Trump, and he narrowly beat Donald Trump. This time he has been losing, and he said the pollsters I talk to don't say I'm losing. The pollsters I talk to don't say my approval rating is bad. So I think the question Democrats are going to ask themselves is he taking a clear-eyed view of where he is in this race, and is he going to give them something to try to right the ship, to try to turn things around? Because at this moment, I don't think Democratic officials heard what they wanted to hear, a lot of them at least, which is a president who knows that he needs to do something big to turn this around.
Basil, Sahil talked about jittery Democrats, and there are sort of a bunch of people for whom this discussion seems very important, and some of them are jittery Democrats, some of them are the chattering class, some of them are the punditry, and some of them, Joe Biden talked about it in one of his responses when George Stephanopoulos seemed to try and ask him, do you understand sort of where this pressure is coming from? And he said, the media. I want to just understand this from your perspective. How should this conversation be going on, and where should it be going on? I don't buy the argument that it shouldn't be happening at all.
Right, I agree.
But what's the way to do this? Because your concern is that Democrats have a tendency to eat their own.
That's true at every level.
Right.
And so some of it's campaign craft, right? That if your party is in power and you're going through a moment like this where your president needs you, what do you do in that moment? So you could say something like, well, you come on TV or wherever and say, you know what? Been a great president the last 4 years. He's entitled to make his own decision, and he'll make that decision. Now, behind the scenes, you recognize that you have some real issues you have to deal with. There's a time crunch. You don't have that much time to the convention nor to the general election. Any party that replaces him is going to have to raise money, going to have to go there and introduce themselves to voters. All of that stuff needs to happen. So there's a whole lot that needs to happen behind the scenes that I think one would be concerned is being brought to the public. And that in and of itself does not necessarily sow confidence in the apparatus. So the campaign craft is really important here. But from a media standpoint, I do think it's important to acknowledge what voters are thinking, how they're feeling, but also be able to not create an equivalency between what we're talking about with respect to Joe Biden, and everything that Donald Trump has said that's been a lie every time he's opened his mouth.
One might argue that it isn't plausibly legal to order SEAL Team 6, and I don't want to slander SEAL Team 6 because they're honorable officers, and they are bound by the Uniform Code of Military Justice not to obey unlawful orders. But no, I think one could say that it's not plausible that is legal, that action would be legal. And I'm sure I've thought of lots of hypotheticals. I'm sure you've thought of lots of hypotheticals where a president could say, I'm using an official power, and yet the president uses it in an absolutely outrageous manner.
It was raised as an extreme, trivial, almost silly and absurd argument during oral arguments before the Supreme Court just a few months ago by conservative Justice Samuel Alito, no less, to show what could come of the ex-president's demands of absolute immunity, a scenario so unthinkable, So unimaginable that it reportedly drew laughter in that very solemn place, the Supreme Court. Cut to the political and legal earthquake that was ushered in by the court's decision on Monday. That same court essentially giving permission to that worst case scenario, a president using his office to order the assassination of a political rival without the backstop of the threat or promise of criminal law and prosecution. Experts are now warning about what that absolute immunity looks like on every level of government, especially national security. The court's opinion, as Politico reports, did not attempt to directly carve out such extreme examples, and that immediately raised alarm among national security experts. The majority instead accused the dissenting justices of, quote, fear-mongering on the basis of extreme hypotheticals. The liberal justices, in their dissents, painted a grim portrait of what we could be looking at in 6 months' time. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote this: if presidents, quote, orders the Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. Justice Sotomayor wrote that. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson acknowledged the president may have the authority to remove the attorney general, for example, but, quote, the question here is whether the president has the option to remove the attorney general by, say, poisoning him to death. More from Politico's reporting, quote, the biggest challenge for a president ordering an assassination would be finding the military personnel willing to carry out the order, legal experts explained. While the president himself would have the protection of immunity, others involved would remain vulnerable to prosecution because the Supreme Court's decision doesn't make the underlying act legal. If they are given an illegal order by the president or by someone who is directly answering to the president, they may be in a position that they are subject to court-martial in either direction. That's according to Claire Finkelstein, a professor of national security law at the University of Pennsylvania. A lawless president, however, could get around that problem by promising to pardon anyone who carried out his orders. It is not an unlikely scenario for ex-President Donald Trump, who already promised pardons for carrying out illegal orders when it came to border security, whose alarming suggestions or even rhetorical questions about shooting protesters in the legs could play out entirely differently now. That already happened, too. This also happened. It was former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley, who told The Atlantic this: if Trump, quote, ordered us to do X, Y, or Z and it was legal, we would do it. If it's not legal, it's my job to say it's illegal, and here's why it's illegal. All that, at best, murky now. Former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi's here. Former CIA Director, now MSNBC Senior National Security Analyst John Brennan's here. Former Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Justice Department, MSNBC legal analyst Mary McCord is here. Mary, I'm going to ask you to start out by just kind of explaining your old job. I mean, national security is, in pop culture, more closely associated with the CIA, right? But its hub really is at the Department of Justice. Explain why, and explain how Monday's decision makes that even more the case.
So, the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, they're part of the president's national security team, along with people like John Brennan when he was the director of the CIA, the director of our intelligence community agencies, and all of the national security agencies. And they sit together at the White House in the Situation Room in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, and talk about national security issues of all sorts of flavors on a daily basis. And the president seeks the advice not only of his legal advisor within the National Security Council, but also the advice of all of the principals who are part of that national security community. And the Department of Justice, also through its Office of Legal Counsel, is a really important part of ensuring that the proposals that are brought to the president, the policy proposals, the actions, are consistent with law. That's domestic law and international law. And I will tell you, in my experience, the premise that undergirds the majority opinion here, that in order for presidents to act fearlessly and boldly in our national security and other matters, they can't be chilled or cowed by the prospect of criminal prosecution. That's just not what is driving these discussions about how to respond to national security issues, whether they're defense-related issues, intelligence-related issues, terrorism issues, or so many other things that come before the National Security Council and the president on a daily basis. So this notion that you need to provide this broad criminal immunity to ensure that presidents can do their job, I think that's just a fiction. I think that was an excuse to write such a capacious ruling that expands presidential functions, what are called in this decision core executive functions that derive from, allegedly, from the Constitution. This capacious, expansive ruling really doesn't have any grounding in our constitutional text or our history, and it's not warranted by any kind of practical necessities. And one other thing I would say is this opinion also seems to assume that we have other functioning remedies for a president who does something that is so, meets the criteria that Justice Alito talked about. But those other methods, things like impeachment, those have failed us in recent years. So the notion that now there is no backstop, that's why you have people so concerned about this opinion.
So, Director Brennan, tell me how this happens operationally and functionally if the president of the United States, as Trump did last time he was president of the United States, wants to do something illegal. And his lawyers, I think Don McGahn, sometimes said, hey, no, that's illegal. He actually would write that down, have his note taker, Annie Donaldson, write it in her notes, too, and then send him a memo saying you can't, for example, prosecute Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey because it's illegal. We know a little bit less about what he wanted to do at the intelligence agencies. We know a little bit more about what he wanted the military to do. At some points, jail migrants. At other points, invoke the Insurrection Act. At other points, seize voting machines. But if he's not stopped by the fear of the consequences of criminality, what happens?
Well, a lot happens, and it's not good. It's hard to be shocked during these abnormal times, but I truly was shocked by the breadth of this Supreme Court ruling. As Mary noted, there are legions of lawyers in the government to ensure that all the actions that the government officials take are going to be legal. And when a president is going to authorize some type of action, whether it be a covert action or some type of military action, there is rigorous legal review that is done at the White House by the legal counsel, but also by the interagency lawyers group to ensure that every order that a president gives is going to be solidly anchored in the law. And this is not to protect a president's, eventual criminal liability. It's because, at least for the 6 presidents that I served, all of them wanted to make sure that everything that they did, everything that their administrations engaged in, was going to be lawful. And so the president of the United States is the chief executive of the executive branch. And so, as Mary's mentioned, the breadth of this ruling is really quite astounding. And I don't think the justices who voted in support of this ruling really understand the implications here, because the president heads up all the departments and agencies in terms of military personnel, law enforcement, intelligence, homeland security. There are so many different opportunities for there to be some type of nefarious action that a president would authorize. And as was pointed out in your lead-in, it's possible that a president could, in fact, issue preemptive pardons to those individuals who would carry out this unlawful act that a president alone is immunized against some type of liability, but they are not unless they actually are giving a presidential pardon. So again, the scope of this, the implications of this, especially if a lawless, corrupt president is going to be in the White House, it is really quite chilling in terms of what could happen.
Frank, we also cover Trump like he's a question mark. He's an answer. He's answered it. He wanted to break the laws. He wanted to have evidence manufactured. He wanted Don McGahn to make up things that didn't exist to get out of criminal exposure with Mueller. He wanted Border Patrol agents to do illegal things, and he dangled pardons in front of them. We also know what he already did at his Department of Justice when it came to wiretaps. We found out at the end of his presidency that he was listening to all manner of journalists. He was listening to lawmakers. What does this absence of any semblance of fear of criminality, how do you assess what Trump would do in a second term with all of the awesome powers of the FBI?
Yeah, as you said, he's told us what he's going to do. He's already done some of it. As it's engraved in over the National Archives in Washington, the past is prologue. Exactly. The past will tell us where we're going in the future with him. And I often think, as I'm contemplating what the impact is on the national security community with this ruling, at first, my reaction was, boy, we're going to have a lot of people in the intelligence community doing unlawful things. But then I stopped myself and I reread the opinion, and it's worse than that because we've redefined what lawful means in this ruling. So, we're all worried, it's going to be unlawful. Oh, we'll have unlawful. No, if the president says it's lawful, it's in the scope of his official duties, his core duties. He's consulted with his attorney general or his Department of Defense secretary, then it could be deemed lawful. So it's not the unlawful acts that I'm worried about. It's the so-called lawful acts that he's going to go forward with. And with regard to Sam Alito's concept that, the dissenters are just talking about extreme hypotheticals, none of this is hypothetical. We need only go back in history to the mid-1970s and the discovery in America that the FBI and the CIA were spying unlawfully on our citizens domestically, and then the Senate had to convene something called the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church. And what did that committee, which sat for over a year, what did they discover? There was systematic spying outside of all judicial rulings, no court authorizations. There were black bag jobs, which means break-ins and illegal search warrants by the FBI. There was wiretapping, unlawful wiretapping of anybody deemed a threat by J. Edgar Hoover, including Martin Luther King, including trying to convince King to kill himself, including the FBI, by most historians now, findings, that coordinating with an intel unit at Chicago PD to actually murder a Black Panthers leader. Right? All of this extrajudicial, there were no rules. So when anybody says, don't worry about it, things will work out. No, we've been there. We've been there. And now we have rules that came out of that Church Committee that actually are the operating guidelines for the FBI, for the CIA. But things had to get very ugly, literally murdering somebody deemed a threat because the FBI director thought the guy was a threat. That's where we're headed here.
Primetime Weekend continues. Ahead with my colleague, Rachel Maddow.
Stormy, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
You do not have to do this. I was very surprised that you agreed to do it, but I've been really looking forward to talking to you for a long time. I guess I mostly just want to know how the last few weeks have been. This has been a many-year saga for you, but this is a qualitatively different time. Since the conviction, it's been a few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a lot. It's been intense. And I think that part of that comes from my mistake of, in my mind, thinking that this would be an ending, that this would be the light at the end of the tunnel. This was the what I was working towards, that it would be like a movie when the judge hits the gavel, the credits roll, and it would be tied up in a nice little gift bow and it would be done. But that's not how real life works. Mm-hmm. And my friends were, celebrating and sending me messages and texts, not just friends, like everybody, people who were happy that, the verdict came down and it was over. But meanwhile, I knew that for me, it was just getting started, because for every person that was excited and thrilled and congratulating me, there was somebody else that was very upset.
Yeah.
And it just poured gasoline on some of that stuff that I had been going through the entire time. And, it's kind of common knowledge now that a lot of the people were doxxed. I know that Cohen was doxxed. They're trying to dox jurors. So the judges were doxxed. I was doxxed. And I know that it's directly related because it happened while I was literally still on the stand.
What's the consequence for you of having your address out there?
My mailbox was destroyed. My animals have been injured. My daughter can't go outside. There's press and looky-loos out there. I'm afraid to go outside. I'm afraid to go out and mow the lawn. I can't go anywhere. I'm afraid of being followed.
Yeah.
The death threats are so much more graphic and detailed and brazen. Like, people don't care. And it's scary, and leading up to the trial was hard enough, like flying up here repeatedly and sitting in the rooms and going through things and reliving all these terrifying moments. The only thing that kept me going, I guess, was thinking that there was an end in sight.
Yeah.
And there's not.
Is there any sense of, vindication? This obviously, Trump being convicted, this is not a case that you brought. This is a case that prosecutors brought. You were brought here as a witness to testify for it. You were subpoenaed to testify. You had no choice about it.
No.
Again, not your case. That said, the way the case was presented to the jury, the prosecutor described to the jury in his closing argument, Stormy Daniels is the motive, saying how crucial your testimony was. Your testimony was not only riveting, it was absolutely integral to the case. Does the verdict sort of feel like a vindication to you, at least in the sense that the story is straight now, that the jury has agreed that he was wrong when he called you a liar?
Yes, but no. I don't understand. Life is not fair. And I am getting constantly attacked. It was called the Stormy Daniels hush money trial, and that's not what it was. It was about falsification of business records. And I was just one thing, but I was the most exciting part, and I was the one that took the stand. I was the one that I think testimony made such an impact. There were so many other people they could have called. They didn't call Karen McDougal. So it was vindicated. When he was found guilty, for that brief moment, it was worth me testifying, because at first I wasn't going to, and I had to shut down my life. I was basically, by choice, sequestered. I didn't work. I didn't tweet. If you know me, that's a big deal. I didn't tweet because I didn't want anything to be misconstrued or entered into evidence and create more work for the prosecution, or get the case thrown out, or disallow me from testifying.
Right.
Did I want to testify? No. Do you know how scary that is? Especially once I got up. If I had known beforehand how nasty Susan Neckles was going to be to me, I might not have. But I also knew that if I didn't testify, that it would look like they didn't want me to, and that I was not to be trusted.
Right.
That there was a reason that they didn't want me to testify. So I knew that I had to, and that it was important. And as soon as he was found guilty, that I knew that I had done the right thing in one aspect. The other side of that is, like you said, I didn't bring these charges. I didn't ask for it. I was subpoenaed. So much of the hate mail that I get is, drop the charges. I'm like, I didn't sue him. I'm getting nothing. It cost me so much to come up here and testify. I was not paid. I'm a registered Republican. Sorry.
She's fine.
Rachel's like, get out.
When you say you paid to come up here, you paid your own expenses to come testify?
Of course, multiple times. I wasn't compensated or written a check or anything like that. I got nothing, and this has cost me so much money. I wasn't paid by anybody. My testimony that I was subpoenaed, that everybody considers me to have done this great duty and be a hero, which I am not. I just told the truth. I was just a human being. I didn't do anything heroic. I didn't go into a burning building. I didn't, I just said the truth. And I've never changed my story, despite what other people said. Go back, look at interviews online from 2019, 2020, 21. My story hasn't changed at all. It's the only one that has been consistent.
Project 2025 wants you to know that Donald Trump will be responsible for what they are calling their second American Revolution.
No credit. We want the American people, if President Trump is elected again, President Trump and his administration, to take credit for that.
The backlash to the radical MAGA agenda is growing in ways we could not have predicted. Wild developments today just on that. Stick around.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.